Hello and welcome to Business Q&A. In this edition, we turn our focus to Africa's cities, which are growing at an unprecedented pace, a surge that brings significant challenges, but also a rare opportunity to transform economies, build climate-resilient communities, and foster inclusive growth. And joining me to unpack this is the founding director of the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town, Professor Edgar Pieterse. Professor, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on your show. Appreciate it.
Well, by 2050, Africa's urban population is expected to hit 1.3 billion people. What implications does this hold for the continent?
Well, it's profound. At the one level, economists will tell you that urbanization is a really good news story for growth. And in our case, because the median age at the moment is only 19 on the continent, it also means that we're going to have a burgeoning labor force. And this is supposedly good news for our economic prospects as a continent. So generally, we know that it's easier to uplift households and people if they're in urban areas from the state's point of view, because you can give them access to basic services, education, healthcare, and so forth. And so they become more productive in the labor force. The challenge is that in Africa at the moment, because we've not kept pace with investing in infrastructure to really support urban growth and make it an economic asset, most of the people are not reaping that benefit. And so our economies are also suffering. So currently outside of South Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, about 55% of urban populations live in slums, which means that they don't have access to the basics. And it also means that it's very difficult for them to get the education that is required to be productive in the economy. At the moment, because we're not providing housing anywhere near the scale that's required, if we are going to double the urban population in just the next 25 years, that growth spells a bit of a disaster unless we intervene at the moment to both get political leadership in place, appropriate regulatory frameworks, and really empower cities to unlock finance to make the necessary infrastructure investments.
Professor, African cities often seem underrepresented in global decision-making platforms like the G20. Why is that?
So we believe that this is because the cities are generally a blind spot, especially for African politicians. So in my center, we've been working with various organizations around the world over the last 15 years to really try and raise the profile of the urban question in Pan-African policymaking. And we've been surprised by the resistance we've met. Most African national leaders still think that urbanization is a bad thing, that the real solution for Africa's problems is agricultural development and remaking Africa the breadbasket of the world. And this is an arcane and outdated point of view. And what this has meant is that they've not done the necessary work to prioritize urbanization and to put in place effective policies. So what we believe is it's really important to demonstrate that even without enabling policies, African cities contribute 70% of Africa's GDP. What that means is that if they're not at the table in terms of macroeconomic debates around trade, around industrialization, around how to manage the debt crisis, etc., all the big themes that gets discussed at the G20, you are missing a trick, because the real people who are on the ground that need to translate these macro policy objectives into specific interventions on the ground that can affect people's lives, if those people are not at the table, you're going to have the wrong conversation. And you are basically going to just speak in an echo chamber without figuring out what does implementation look like and how do you align your societal resources to come in behind very practical plans to move away from the current situation of underinvestment to one where we can get ahead of the curve and begin to do anticipatory planning and be ready for this urbanization wave.
What are the key goals of the Unstoppable Force initiative?
Yes, so we've established, as I said, because of this long-standing lack of policy attention, we've created this coalition of think tanks around the world, mainly Africa, but also from other geographies. And we call our campaign an Unstoppable Force. And this is really to underscore the fact that urbanization is not something to be feared, it is something to be embraced. And that if we plan for it properly, we can really simultaneously deal with the climate crisis, we can deal with the human development crisis we face on the continent, and most importantly, we can anticipate what we need to put in place to create jobs for young people that will be the majority of our cities. And so what this campaign is doing is it's using the G20 debates this year as a context to say, at the moment, there's massive underinvestment. We're just not getting financing to city governments in Africa. There's only 6 African countries that allows their cities to borrow from international markets. Everyone else, it's prevented. And so, for example, one of the campaign messages is that why don't we use our national development banks across the continent and get them to draw down Forex in terms of international loans, fulfill an intermediary function, and on-lend in local currency to city governments as a way of overcoming this capital deficit that we see in most African cities. That's one example. Secondly, there's now talk at an Pan-African level and with national governments to really embrace green industrialization. And of course, the critical minerals discussion is central to that. And we know this is a big theme for the G20 this year. What we are saying is, if you look at the infrastructure that's required from digital platforms through to renewable energy, thinking about industrial strategy around automotives and EVs and so forth, all of this happens in cities. And so surely you have to have the people who have the political responsibility for governance and planning and for fiscal alignment. You have to have them in the conversation about how does urban infrastructure investments dovetail with green industrialization strategies. And we're hoping that the G20 will create a context within which we can connect those dots. Because up until now, they've not been connected, and certainly African leaders have not been making these connections. So we're creating an opportunity for African mayors to be in dialogue with ministers and mayors from around the world to say to the G20, this is a fundamental precondition for success for all of the macro development issues that the South African government has set out. So that's the messaging that the Unstoppable Force campaign is trying to bring across.
Well, certainly sounds like a very, very important initiative. We're going to have to leave it there. Still had a few questions, but we've run out of time, Professor. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
That was Professor Edgar Pieterse, Founding Director of the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town. Stay tuned for more business insights right here on Business Day Television.